Hi, so um, I'm going to begin this lecture by discussing the changes that have taken place since in terms of the context and historical development since modernism. So, the kind of literature that was being produced, and now we come to a stage where colonization faces a crisis because um, First World War is fought, the Second World War is fought, and after that, the world and the politics of the world changes a lot. Two blocks are made in the world. One is the Western bloc, which is the democratic bloc, and then the other is the communist and socialist blocs. So at this time, because the European powers had faced a lot of um, because of the world wars, they had faced a lot of damage to their infrastructure, towards their power overall. So the colonies that they controlled started moving towards independence and nationalist movements. And in some cases, like India, the Britishers let India gain independence in 1947, resulting in two new independent states being born, India and Pakistan. In the same way, but on the other hand, there were other colonies that were part of the colonial powers, like French Algeria. The independence movement there was very, very brutal, and it resulted in millions of deaths, a complete bloodbath. Simultaneously, there were lots of francophone, anglophone authors who were born during these times, poets who wrote nationalist literature, who wrote about the problems that colonization had caused. So a new kind of literature was born with this. On the one hand, this kind of literature revived the realist traditions of writing. So in post-colonial, and the literature was specifically called post-colonial literature because most of the colonies gained independence during or after this time. And as new nations, they faced new challenges, both internally and externally from their old masters or the colonizers. And at the same time, a new kind of literature which targeted modern literature was born, which is called the postmodern literature. So let's start discussing the characteristics of post-colonial literature first, because that is a very important aspect of literature, and it creates a field nowadays of its own. So post-colonial literature was a literature written in English or written in the language of the colonizers, but produced by the people who were colonized. These people had been educated in Britain, in France, in Spain, in the colonizer countries, but they wrote for and they propagated the rights of their own people. So, for example, Aime Cesaire, who you read his criticism, the discourse on colonialism. Cesaire was the person who started the negritude movement, a movement to bring Black consciousness to the forefront, to talk about intellectual capacity of the Africans, and it was a very successful movement in its own way. And the movement talks about the things that had been relegated to the background of history. For example, the Europeans never gave a chance to the Africans to develop their own culture, to talk about their own problems, talk about their own lives. Their information on Africa was generated by the West, which means it was a very, very they objectified the colonies, the people, their characteristics. This is how a lot of stereotypes were born during the time. So this movement and a lot of other movements, they were aimed to show what these people were really like. So post-colonial literature is the literature written by the people from the colonies in response to the empire. And so you will see titles like The Empire Writes Back or The Empire Strikes Back, where people from the colonies respond to the valued judgments and the harshness of the colonial practices, and talk about what damage that they had done, and what damages, and how these damages were so long lasting, and what the impact of these damages was. So if you see Discourse on Colonialism, I will go over that a little bit for you to understand it. Let's see. Now, Discourse on Colonialism, if you see the discussion post, I have made out parts for you. The first part of Discourse of Colonialism discusses the pitfalls or the problems of civilization, of the Western civilization. He talks about how a civilization which cannot deal with the problems it has created is a civilization which is in the process of being, which is in the process of going through change or going through a time of downfall. And he also addresses the concept of European hypocrisy, that they say something but they actually do something else. And he says that the Africans do not believe in their lives anymore. So again, this was a very nationalist stance that was taking place. Remember, nationalist movements were very important for the process of decolonization, because nationalism became the thing that people fought for, that we are a nation, we have nothing to do with the West, so we want to get independent. So for example, in India, people were talking about how we are an Indian nation, nothing to do with the Britishers, and we want an independent state for our own selves. So nationalism was a very, very important aspect of decolonizing. So this is what he talks about, that they can no longer deceive, because Africans can see through their hypocrisy. Then he talks about what colonization is. He talks about the justifications for colonization. Now, a big production of literature during this period of time was directed towards how colonialism was actually a very, very it was benign. It was aimed to improve the people. It was colonizing. It was done in the name of religion. It was done in the name of bringing spirituality to these people. But what he says here, and he goes through so much literature written in France at that time to show that this was not true, that the religious justifications came later, that the real reason for the colonial enterprise was materialism, was the exploitation of resources, was the exploitation of labor, so that they could have slave labor. So what he does is he removes this cloud or obscurity of myth that governs our ideas, that this was actually done in a true spirit, and it went awry and it went wrong. No, it never did that, because these justifications came later, and the intent was always materialistic, and the intent was to expand the empire at the expense of other people. And then he talks about multiculturalism, talks about why he's not saying that mixing of cultures is a bad thing. He says that colonialism, though, was a wrong way to do it. I'm just going to quickly go over all of these points, but I'm hoping and I am assuming that you have read the text itself and you will be able to follow. So, he also claims that colonization did not produce anything of human value. And when he uses the term human value, he means in terms of bringing something other than something ethical, something good out of it. He says that the only thing that the colonized are left with is the destruction caused by the colonizers. So we move to the second part, where he talks about how colonization brutalizes and decivilizes the colonizer by the impact of by creating the impact of how civilization starts disintegrating. Now, if you remember, that is something that Conrad deals with in Heart of Darkness as well. He talks about how the darkness in Africa kind of like morally empties the colonizer, but that is not what Aime Cesaire talks about. Aime Cesaire basically says that the concept of savagery was already present within the Europeans who colonized. He talks about how the seeds of evil were already there, and Europeans, the bourgeoisie, he talks about the middle class because that was the class that was writing philosophy, that was the class that was uh, providing justifications, that was the class that was sending anthropologists and scientists to look at these people and look at them in a scientific manner. So he criticizes them and he says that the concept of evil was already within them because they never spoke against the horrors that were happening within Africa and within the colonized nations, because those horrors, we discussed them in class, were terrible. I mean, so for example, if you look at the murders and deaths in Congo, they exceed the deaths that happened in the Holocaust. But I'm sure that you wouldn't have known about it had you not studied what was happening within the Congo. So nobody talks about it because those things are whitewashed within the history. All right, so he says that those things are already present there, but when the bourgeoisie and the middle classes and those colonizing powers never spoke about them, those things came back in a circle and damaged the civilization himself. So he's not really talking in the Conrad way where he's saying it damages the soul. He's saying that those evils, when you don't stop them and nip them in the bud if they're affecting others, they will eventually reach the civilization itself. And he gives the example of Nazism. He says that people are shocked that, oh my God, how was Hitler born? How did Hitler actually harm so many people? But he says the real horror for people around the world was not the fact that people were being killed. The real horror was that Europeans were being killed, that people who were white were being killed and harmed. That became the main issue, and that was why it was so widely understood. He's at no place is he condoning it. He's just explaining that this became understandable when it actually hit home to those people, that what you do actually comes around and hits you as well. So he says that Hitler is equal to savagery and that Hitler is present in all of us. That is what he is saying, that if we don't take care, those things are actually going to damage the civilization itself. Simultaneously, in the second part, he talks about and starts critiquing capitalism, because capitalism is an essential thing that emerged within colonization. The whole point of colonization was to gain capital from these nations, to gain free labor, something that capitalism is built on, and something that these nations are still experiencing. Whenever I think about it, where do these big corporations and these multinational corporations send their production? Why have they moved their production overseas, to China, to other countries like Indonesia? And the reason is that they can exploit the labor because the labor is extremely cheap there, and so these companies can make exorbitant profits on the lives of these and the livelihoods of these people. And yes, most of these nations are free, but who was left there? That is another one of these problems that a lot of post-colonial authors and critics talk about. And it is that whenever we say that, oh, these nations have become independent, now they're responsible for themselves, and the Western powers who colonized them are no longer responsible, that actually speaks of a complete blindside in what they have understood about colonization, and they're actually again blinding people about the reality, because the way the world is set, these nations, in order to survive, had to either side with the two blocks that I mentioned, either the Western powers or the socialist communist powers. And with the making of the World Bank and the World Financial Institutions of the United Nations, these nations which were struggling economically because they had been deprived of their resources by these Europeans and by the Western powers, now they struggled to make ends meet, to remove poverty. And so this whole new system of helping the third world countries or helping the poor countries was born, which is funny because after damaging and exploiting the resources of these people, you send your saviors to save them again from poverty and misery. And also with the nationalist movements, the ruling class that came to power in many of these countries was a replication of the colonial powers. They were cruel, they were mercenary, they were materialistic, and they did not care about the people. So what happens is that when the Europeans left, they left behind themselves a class trained in their own arts. So for example, Many colonies in the beginning even kept slavery alive for a bit. So it is important to understand that just because decolonization has taken place, it does not mean that exploitation has ended. And in many cases, when the governments were forcibly overthrown, the colonial governments, like in the case of France, the United Nations and the League of Nations refused to accept the new independent state because they had violated France's right over the slaves and over the people, which is extremely cruel. So in order to be recognized, which is very important, because if you're not recognized, you cannot have trade and your country can die of poverty and the people all can be harmed in a very serious way. These countries had to pay France so much money in taxes, and these countries include countries like Jamaica and sorry. And so what happens is that they are now indebted to the World Bank. They have to pay in exorbitant loans to they have to pay exorbitant amounts of interest on their loans, and they can never get out of it. This is a trap that was set again by the colonial powers. This is now termed imperialism, neo-imperialism, and neo-colonization, where you don't have to be physically present in a country to exploit its resources. But that is happening in most of the most of the post-colonial world. So a lot of post-colonial literature deals with this issue. Now, moving on to the third part of Aime Cesaire's criticism, he talks about how colonization destroys civilizations. Not only the civilizations that are colonized by the Western powers, but also the Western powers themselves. He talks about how the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized can never be equal. And he talks about how this relationship is extremely toxic, this relationship is extremely damaging, and one side of the binary, which is the colonized, are always in misery, acute misery. So also it dehumanizes and turns everything into material. I'm going to use this quote that he added here, which is very important, which kind of sums up all of his argument, is my turn to state an equation. Colonization is equal to thingification. And thingification means it turns everything into things. It turns human labor into a thing that can be gained through slavery. It turns materials that are present within the colonies into materials that need to be exploited, and human life is left with no value. So, for example, in South Africa, where the diamond mines are, it is still a very, very conflicted situation there. Diamonds were one of the things that the colonizers went after. This native population who actually owned that stuff is still in misery, and it is the people, the settler colony, this settler colonizers who actually still have access to it. So it is a very, very damaging situation. Now, he talks about how when West claims that, oh, we developed this, we installed railways, we installed this and that, a lot of things in response to people saying that they only did damage. And he brings up examples, really good examples of how when they say they have developed, let's say, a railway track through something. The thing that is important to understand there is that that track came at the expense of millions of lives, and the track was not made for the advantage of the colonized. It was made for the advantage and for the ease of the colonizers. So he brings all of these things to light in the third part. And then he says, he addresses the people who criticize him as an enemy of Africa, an enemy of Europe. And he says that no, there is a very good face of Europe too. They were good people, but the face that the Africans met was not good, was terrible. And he simultaneously says that he is not calling, like people accuse him of a return to the origins of Africa, because for one thing there can be no return, and for another he's not aiming for that. He's aiming for a culture which is independent and which can stand on its own and which is not exploited. So in the fourth part, he talks about how there is savagery within the European civilization itself. And He also discusses in a lot of detail with lots of examples about how there is a capacity in Europe of shutting off your ears to anything that contradicts your idea or your stereotype of the colonized. So this whole part is a discussion of how we need to open our eyes and be broad-minded and able to see the difference in other people. Then in part 5, he talks about the Western civilization and their claims to knowledge. That is a very important thing, that we brought science, we brought rationality, we brought development to these areas, and we were the only group of people, or the only civilization that actually contributed something to the human store of knowledge, which is very problematic in many ways, because maths, a very essential part of the early science, was all in the beginning something that was developed by the Arabs, not the West. And these things are things that are never given light to. So anything that he says that contradicts this whole myth that the Western civilization is superior, or the Western civilization has some kind of very important knowledge, he refutes that with examples in this section. Then we move on to section part 6. And he talks about 3 groups of people: the geographers who chart the territory, the psychologists who talk about the psychology of the Africans and the psychology of the colonized people, and the theologians who talk about the spiritual aspect. He says that they provide very silly, very, very funny justifications for the atrocities that their nations have been committing, and so they are equally responsible for whatever has happened in the colonized races. This is very essential, because remember, in Heart of Darkness, there are people who go there for money, and then there are people who go there to spread religion and spread spirituality, and he says that is a very, very wrong mission. He also talks about the concept of white man's burden. Why did the Westerners think that there was a need in them to actually go and civilize someone? Why did they think that they were more important than the rest of them? So he questions those ideas. Then in part 7, he discusses how scholars use wrong information to show that everything in the world related to progress is done by them. And specifically, he discusses the white man's burden. And when we use the term the white man's burden, we're specifically talking about the concept that white men, or the Europeans specifically, thought that they had a God-given responsibility to actually humanize and civilize the remaining races of the world, which they used as an excuse to plunder and exploit the people. So he discusses that, and he talks about how these views are being shown as something very important in a lot of colonial literature too. Now, just so that you keep the novel that we are studying in mind, in Heart of Darkness, when Marlowe says goodbye to his aunt, she says bye to him by telling him, and she thinks that he has an amazing mission to go and civilize these people. That actually reflects the sentiment of the bourgeoisie, or the middle class of that time, because she didn't realize that where he's going is he's not going for any civilizing mission. He's going for his own personal gains, and that is the sentiment that Cesaire is criticizing here. And in the last portion of Aime Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, he talks about capitalism and how all of this gave rise to capitalism, and how capitalism disenfranchises and degrades further the already exploited ex-colonies of the world. So I hope that this criticism makes you understand Heart of Darkness a little more, and why Heart of Darkness was criticized so much and is still being criticized so much by post-colonial authors and critics. Also, if you're interested, you might want to read Aime Césaire's poems. They are beautiful. He was an amazing poet, and is still widely read in African American literature and in Caribbean literature. So I would highly suggest those of you who write poetry, who like poetry, to go over his poetry. They are translated. They were originally in French, but do go over them. And then we have Chinua Achebe, the second article, where Achebe criticizes directly the novel Heart of Darkness and talks about the racism within that novel. I have written a little bit about it, but I think that this paper is very self-explanatory. He talks about how the Africans are never given a voice, they are not allowed to speak, And he talks about the horror of the kinship that Conrad mentions whenever he talks about the Africans, and he talks about how that kinship, the idea that there is some similarity between the Africans and the Europeans, really bothers Conrad. So read about it, tell me what your views are, and if there is anything else that you don't understand, and I hope you're able to add to the discussion post, and we'll be ready for the last portion of literature that I'll be uploading soon. And I hope you're working on your research papers. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can comment below, or you can just send me an email. So yeah, that's it, and see you in next lecture.